In Toronto, Canada, on the 7th of August 1925, Christina Macon was born to Casimir and Mary Macon. A working-class family of Polish heritage, the Macons lived in Toronto's Mimico area, a neighborhood that, in the early 20th century, was home to many immigrant families. Carried with them from many Polish households were traditions of faith, family, and close community ties, which provided a sense of stability in their new country. The backdrop of the Great Depression was against which Christina grew up, a time when families across the city faced widespread economic uncertainty. In Mimico, careful budgeting and modest living marked daily life, and neighbors often relied on one another for support. After she finished school, Christina secured a job at the Bank of Toronto, where she proved herself to be competent and efficient. She was not someone who sought to stand out, but rather a young woman who appeared typical of the time, conscientious, family-centered, and hardworking. Like many immigrant families of the era, her parents valued stability and a life that appeared respectable in the eyes of the community. For Christina, they hoped she would follow a path that promised security and dignity, with marriage providing the natural next step towards a steady and traditional future. In the 1940s, Christina met John Ray Kettlewell, known as Jack, a young man only a few years her senior. Not long after, Jack was called up for service in the Second World War, where he served as a sergeant in the Dental Corps. Upon returning home, he found work in the insurance business and re-established himself in Toronto. He had his own circle of friends, among them a man named Ronald Barry, who was known as a very lively character. Having been born Ronaldo Schiffo, Ronald had immigrated from Italy with his family in the 1920s, later adopting the name Ronald Barry because he believed it sounded more in keeping with life in Canada. Outgoing and stylish, he was a former professional ballroom dancer who had given up the stage to launch his own construction business. Despite his confident manner, the venture never prospered, leaving him weighed down by significant financial difficulties. More than just an acquaintance, Ronald was a close companion to Jack. They not only frequently traveled and socialized together, by 1947, they were living in the same boarding house, sharing a room. About Christina's relationship with Jack, her parents were wary, not only because of the fact that he was not a Roman Catholic, but also because of his close friendship with Ronald Barry, whose frequent presence felt intrusive and whose influence they did not fully trust. They also worried about Jack's temperaments and uncertain career prospects, and the tension in their home only deepened as the courtship continued. Despite their reservations, Christina continued to see Jack, and on the 12th of May, 1947, the couple were married in Toronto. Following the wedding, they spent a few days in an apartment on Tyndall Avenue. Then, on the 17th of May, along with Ronald, Jack and Christina set out for their honeymoon at a remote cottage in Seven Falls, Ontario, a secluded retreat about 190 kilometers from Toronto and 40 kilometers north of Aurelia. The property, which belonged to Ronald, was accessible only by boat. Somewhat awkward was this arrangement, and although outwardly she presented herself as a cheerful newlywed, Christina was frustrated that her husband had brought his friend along on what was meant to be their honeymoon. The cottage's isolation, coupled with Ronald being there, lent an unease to an otherwise idyllic getaway. A very serious turn was taken by the situation on the 20th of May, 1947, when smoke was seen rising from the cottage. Upon returning to the scene, Ronald found Jack lying on the floor with a head injury, while Christina was nowhere to be seen. Almost immediately, the fire intensified, and the flames rapidly consumed the wooden structure. Within minutes, the cottage was reduced to a scorched framework of timber and scattered ashes, leaving only the remains of what had once been a secluded retreat. Ronald and Jack managed to escape the fire, and later, Christina's body was discovered just a short distance away in 9 inches of water. Lying face down, she was fully clothed and showed no signs of burns or smoke inhalation. To determine the cause of her death, an autopsy was immediately undertaken. The examination established that she had drowned, despite the shallow depth of water in which she was found. Investigators also discovered traces of codeine in her system, a detail that raised further questions about the circumstances leading up to her death and whether any external factors had contributed to the tragedy. Quickly becoming a person of interest in the investigation was Ronald Barry, who was among the first questioned by the police. When he was asked whether or not the cottage had been insured, he replied, "We lost everything." When something like this happens, insurance is the last thing you think about. It can't replace what was lost. It's like losing a life. We had planned to spend the whole summer here away from everyone. The flowers were beautiful, and we had planned to plant so many more. But I suppose I shouldn't say any more. I've already said too much. He was then taken into police custody, where he was interviewed for 6 hours and produced a comprehensive 3,000-word statement. Music. After his time at the police station, Ronald was released pending further investigation. He spoke to reporters, claiming that this had been a tragic accident, although he did not want to reveal too much. He did say that originally he had no plans to accompany the couple on their honeymoon and instead was going to join them later, but as they had so much luggage, Mr. Thomas, who was his and Jack's landlord, told him to take his car and drive them to the cottage. On Monday, the 26th of May, Christina's funeral took place at St. Leo's Church, the same church where she had been married just 2 weeks earlier. Over the following days, the police continued to gather information about the tragedy, taking statements and examining every circumstance that might clarify the cause of Christina's death. As they emerged, newspapers reported the known facts, along with a good deal of speculation, while the public followed each development with keen interest. Daily bulletins and headlines kept the tragedy in the spotlight, and discussions in cafes and workplaces reflected a mix of sympathy, curiosity, and suspicion. A frequent topic of conversation remained the case, with each update drawing close attention not only within the province of Ontario but across the whole of Canada. The nation followed the proceedings closely, gripped by the haunting image of the 8-day bride, a young woman whose life had ended almost before her marriage had begun. On the 19th of June, the formal inquest was convened in the town of Bracebridge. The Crown Counsel assigned to the inquest was Mr. C.P. Hope. He immediately pointed out Ronald Barry's suspicious role in what has happened on the 20th of May, describing him as a liar of the most blatant kind whose sinister figure permeates the whole of this tragedy. Yet his purpose and design are shrouded in mystery. A series of questionable financial dealings were uncovered by the inquest, which had left Ronald virtually broke. Before they married, 2 separate life insurance policies, each for a sum of $5,000, had been taken out on Jack and Christina. And on each one, the beneficiary was Ronald. The policies included double indemnity clauses, which meant that he would receive twice the amount in the event of either of them having died by the way of an accident. He had also renewed his lapsed insurance policy on the cottage before traveling to Seven Falls. There were also questions about Christina's husband, Jack Kettlewell, why he had entrusted everything he owned to Ronald, and of course, why did he ask his friend to accompany him and his new wife on their honeymoon? It was noted that Jack had borrowed a ring to propose to Christina, and this ring had not been recovered. When Jack nervously took the stand, he said that he believed that Christina tried to poison both him and herself by adding something to their food. He explained that he became very ill, but when Ronald discovered him, he gave him medicine to induce vomiting, which helped him recover. However, Jack's responses to the questions at the inquest failed to convince Mr. Hype, who reminded him that in a statement he had given to the police shortly after the fire, he told officers that he had indeed been involved in the relationship with Ronald Barry, although he now claimed that this was not so and that he had been pressured into making the statement. A particularly troubling aspect of the case was a series of letters Christina had written to Ronald, in which she revealed her emotional turmoil and distress. Read out at the inquest, these letters told of her desire to rent her life by her own hands. Evident it was that Christina had expressed despair and an alarming sense of hopelessness. One, written weeks before her wedding, declared that she could not endure the thought of Jack with another woman. Another mentioned her intention to poison both herself and Jack. The final letter, written the day before her death, was addressed to Mrs. Thomas, the owner of the Mimico boarding house, where Christina had briefly stayed with Jack. Christina had asked Ronald to mail the letter, which read, "Ronnie is in the boat outside somewhere. By the time he gets back, everything will be over with. He must have been afraid something would happen because he is staying an extra day to make sure we go back to Toronto with him." Whether these letters were cries for help or deliberate preparations for self-destruction was never clear, but they painted a portrait of a young woman in turmoil. Stephen Letts, a former Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer and handwriting expert, testified that he was certain that these letters had been written by the young 22-year-old bride. Mrs. Edith Thomas, the landlady at the boarding house where Ronald and Jack lived, also gave evidence. She told the inquest that on the night of the wedding, Christina's sisters had come to the house to try and dissuade her from marrying. It was said that Christina told them that she wanted to marry Jack and that Ronald had told Christina that she must choose and that if she did not want to marry Jack, she should leave with her sisters. Mrs. Thomas added that Ronald Barry owed her money and that he had made no attempt to pay it back. Her husband, Mr. Richard Thomas, also testified. He described Christina as a happy bride and recalled that she had told him that she did not want Ronald Barry to accompany her and her new husband on their honeymoon. He also said that Christina had told him that Ronald had borrowed $200 from her and that she had tried to recover some of it just before the wedding but had been unable to do so. The name Ronald Barry seemed to dominate the inquest, and the newspapers questioned his role in the terrible tragedy. He owned the honeymoon cottage. He had received Christina's letters. And he was the beneficiary of the insurance policies that covered Christina's death and the destroyed property. However, when he took the stand, he repeated the somewhat bizarre statement that he had already given the police. He insisted that he had loaned Christina $12,500 before her marriage. He said he had done this because she had been attacked by 4 or 5 men in a Toronto dance hall and that these men were now blackmailing her. According to him, Christina repaid him $13,000, which included $500 of interest. However, when Mr. Hope questioned Ronald about his income, things did not really add up. In 1945, his net income had been $1,500. In 1946, he built 2 houses and earned about $1,000 from each. And in 1947, he had no income at all. He admitted borrowing $3,000 in 1946 from the Bank of Montreal and claimed that he gave $2,000 of this loan to Christina. And later, when she asked for another $3,000, he borrowed that too and handed it to her. He also said that he borrowed money from relatives and friends to assist her. He told the inquest that he had no knowledge of where Christina, a bank employee on a modest salary, had obtained these large sums of money to pay him back. The handwriting expert, Stephen Letts, confirmed that Christina had signed the receipt for $12,000, but stated that she had signed this document before the details of it were filled in. Those details, he said, were written in the handwriting of Ronald Barry. Ronald denied all the accusations put to him. He had also said that his and Jack's relationship was nothing more than that of friends and that he had not arranged Jack and Christina's marriage, though he had helped with some of the honeymoon plans. However, under intense questioning, he eventually conceded that he and Jack had once been very close, but that was some years ago. He told the inquest that after the wedding, he had tried to keep out of the couple's way. But one morning when he entered the cottage, he saw Jack lying unconscious by the window and Christina was there and asked him for a pen as she wanted to write something. He went on to say that that evening he returned to the cottage and found Jack was bleeding from a head wound. Christina, however, he said was missing. He told of how he searched in the woods for her and then he noticed that the cottage had suddenly caught fire. So he returned and dragged Jack away from the burning building. Much of Ronald's statement was not believed by Mr. Hope. He had carefully examined Christina's bank transactions and found that there was nothing irregular about them. He reminded the inquest that Christina worked as a ledger keeper and nothing could explain the serious money dealings that Ronald Barry talked about surrounding her death. Fascinated by the case, newspapers devoted countless columns and front-page space to covering every detail from the wedding, the mysterious finances, and the tragic events that happened on the 20th of May. They wrote of how Jack had suffered burns in the fire but appeared distinctly uneasy when questioned. His statements, they claimed, were inconsistent, especially under cross-examination. They questioned whether his connection with Ronald Barry went beyond ordinary friendship, which in the Zeros was regarded as scandalous. The speculation only heightened public curiosity and cast further doubt over Jack's part in the tragedy. The fire itself compounded the uncertainty. The cottage, which had been intended as a haven for the new couple, had been destroyed so completely that it erased what might have been crucial evidence. Investigators could not determine whether the blaze had been set deliberately or sparked by accident. What was certain was that its timing had created chaos, obscuring the sequence of events and delaying the search for Christina. Little clarity was offered by medical testimony. The autopsy had revealed traces of codeine, though not in quantities sufficient to explain death. There was no sign of physical violence, no blows, no strangulation, nothing to suggest an assault. The cause was drowning, but how Christina ended up in the water remained unanswered. The absence of conclusive physical evidence meant that the case hinged only on circumstantial evidence, on the interpretation of the letters, of her relationship, and of the ambiguous circumstances surrounding the fire. As the inquest continued and more witnesses took the stand, the jury was tasked with a very difficult responsibility, to determine whether Christina had died by her own hands or was murdered. Each theory found some support in the testimony, yet each left troubling gaps. Death by her own hands seemed plausible in light of her letters, but her decision to marry and then take her own life just 8 days later complicated that view. Murder could not be ruled out, especially with the suspicions surrounding Ronald and Jack, but there was no proof. An accident was possible, though the sequence of events leading to her drowning defied simple explanation. Dr. Tennant described his impression of Ronald Barry, calling him a pathological liar. He explained that such people told lies so often and so convincingly that they eventually believed in themselves. Ronald Barry, he said, was a sort who enjoyed deceiving others. Inspector Wright of the provincial police testified that the accounts Christina kept at the bank were in perfect order. An Ontario fire marshal also reported that examinations of the honeymoon cottage showed no sign of an accidental fire, but it was impossible to determine how exactly it started. In his address to the jury, Mr. Hype described Christina as a beautiful and happy young woman who had been misled. He said her husband Jack Kettlewell was weak in character and dominated by Ronald Barry, who he called a sinister figure tangled up in deception, love, and sexuality. Mr. Hype highlighted the autopsy finding that Christina had codeine in her system, noting that the quantity discovered might have been part of a larger dose. Turning to the events of the 20th of May, Mr. Hype said that the testimony suggested that Christina may have prepared a poisoned meal and that later that afternoon Ronald Barry was found in possession of her final letter. He added that although Ronald had denied ever reading it, it could not be proven whether he had or not. Mr. Hype also questioned how Christina's body had been discovered in the shallow water. She had been barefoot, yet there were no marks on her feet to show that she had walked there herself. He asked whether she might have been carried, and if so, who could have done it. By saying this, he was implying that Ronald Barry was the only one capable of doing so. Mr. Hype also dismissed as ridiculous the story about Ronald lending Christina $12,000 to pay off supposed blackmailers after she was attacked in the Toronto dance hall. However, despite the evidence presented, the jury delivered an open verdict, as they could not say with certainty how Christina had died, only that she had drowned under circumstances that remained unresolved. The law left the matter unsettled, and so too did public imagination. Music. The inquest may have ended, but speculation about Christina's fate only grew in the years that followed. One theory was that Christina took her own life. The letter she wrote and her apparent emotional fragility supported this view. If she had swallowed codeine, then walked to the river in despair, the drowning might have been self-inflicted. But the presence of Ronald Barry complicated this interpretation. His name on insurance policies, his receipt of Christina's letters, and his proximity to the events all seemed suspicious. Some suggested that Ronald orchestrated events to his advantage, though no solid evidence tied him directly to Christina's death. Jack, too, remained under suspicion in some quarters. Was he complicit with Ronald? Was he negligent or merely a victim of circumstance? His injury from the fire clouded his testimony, and his closeness to Ronald was a point of contention. Another persistent question was why Christina's body was not discovered sooner. Witnesses claimed that the riverbank had been searched earlier that day without success, suggesting the possibility that her body had been placed there later. With the inquest concluded, no charges were ever filed. Christina's death remained officially unresolved. For our family, the result was a painful void. Their daughter had been alive and full of promise just days before. Now she was gone. Her story reduced to unanswered questions and scandalous headlines. In the decades since, the case has been revisited by journalists, writers, and true crime enthusiasts. It is remembered as a tale of the 8-day bride, a haunting reminder of how quickly a life can end and how elusive the truth can remain. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next briefcase.